Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the number one question I get asked via email, online, in person, and that is, what should I respond to my doctor who wants me to be on statins? Well, it comes down to two things. One is you need to know why your doctor, he or she, is recommending. They are required to recommend, to mention that you should be on statins. That's just the way it is in the Western world, in the United States, from which I'm speaking. But also, the onus is on you to understand what they're talking about. So this is to give you information to let you make an educated decision. And I think the answer is pretty straightforward. So I'm entitling this, Are Statins a Gateway Drug to Diabetes? And there's already been a number of papers out there that have answered this question. I'm going to go into not the arcane aspect of the papers, but a logical, easy to understand where you need to go to this information and what that information is going to tell you. So this is what you need to ingest. This is what you need to bring to your doctor. This is what you need to know because you need to take responsibility for yourself about this particular decision, which is a big decision actually. Okay, so are statins a gateway drug to diabetes? It's kind of inflammatory, but that's the gist of it. What you absolutely must know about your LDL. Are you still being told your LDL and your total cholesterol is too high? This is what you need to know first. So first part, I'm going to go why elevated cholesterol is not a personal health risk. For most people, I have to add that. Second, what is a diabetic in terms of labs and what your labs will show you and have showed me. So, you ready? Let's get into it. Okay, part one, LDL, low density lipoprotein, what you need to know, or rather what you should know. And this is going to be a common sense approach. I am not going into the biochemistry, understanding of the whole lipid metabolism and so on. That's already been done. That's not useful information to help you come to a real practical decision about what you're going to do about your body. Okay? Okay, first thing you need to know is that there's been a lot of skepticism, a lot of pushback on cholesterol ever being a bad thing in the first place, regardless of the whole statin issue. The cholesterol hypothesis of heart disease has been questioned arguably for 100 years, but I'm going to point you to who are the loudest voices and who are the most respected and who are the most intelligent, okay? This man here, he's nearly 90 now, Uffe Ravneskov. He's an MD out of Denmark, and he's been a professor at medical schools and so on, and he's still around and quite vibrant. And so anyway, so primarily the number one person who never believed this hypothesis. Danish medical doctor, independent researcher, and this is from Wikipedia, so you can, I'm going to minimize the link so you don't get too congested here. But his organization that he founded back in the 90s is called the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, otherwise known as THINKS. Very good. High cholesterol is beneficial. And he goes in, the campaign started a cholesterol is harmful is the greatest medical scandal in modern time. This is my, meaning Dr. Ravskov's perspective, conclusion after having studied the scientific background in detail for more than 30 years. Read what I have written and I am confident that you will agree unless you have a major income, your major income is derived from drug companies or the margarine industry. So there you go, and you can even contact him personally should you want to. These are books that he's written, but he is now, in my view, the international center of a lot of smart people and some of the names you probably already recognize. Okay, so where did this start? I've done videos on this before, so I'm not going to go too deep into where this got started, but primarily it came to Ancel Keys back in the late 50s. He did a thing called 7-Country Study, otherwise known as SCS. To his credit, though, Ancel Keys, who died in 2004, he lived 100. So, and he was the one who basically coined the Mediterranean diet and so on and so forth. But in this particular situation of faulting cholesterol, I believe he was completely wrong. And I'll go into a number of points without going too deep. As I say, I've covered that before. You can sort of see the link above here to go in more deeply on that. So 7-Country Studies was really a 24, 25 country study that he sort of cherry picked and presented what he wanted to present. So it was fraudulent from the beginning, Ancel Keys. But at the time, in the 60s, 1961, he was Time Man of the Year. And he's not even a doctor, by the way. So back to the THINKS organization by Uffe Ravneskov. These are videos you can look up. This is Malcolm Kendrick. I hope you know who he is. He's a Scottish physician who's very thoughtful, and he's written books as well. And all these people, I could say, these are the books they've written. I'm just giving you links of what you need to do for a short list, okay? At the top of recent information is 2014, there's an Australian, Marianne Demasi. She wrote a book which is basically summarizing a lot of what Dr. Rathskoff has been arguing for the last 30 years. And the one point I want to point out is that there's a lot of money behind Lipitor. Lipitor is a statin and has been the most profitable drug in the history of medicine. Nobody's going to turn a blind eye to Lipitor to say, hey, we're going to shut this down, okay? So just know that there's a financial incentive. I'm sort of saying the obvious. I'm sort of preaching to the choir, so to say, but you need to know that. Here are the references. I'm just giving you a foundation that is foolproof for yourself, hopefully, but certainly for your doctor. So here's a paper. If you had to go one paper to give to your doctor, this would be the paper. It came out in 2016. It is written by basically everybody who is part of the THINKS organization, right? The cholesterol skeptics, international cholesterol skeptics. Okay, lack of an association or an inverse association between LDL, low density lipoprotein cholesterol, and mortality in the elderly. They're saying there's no, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Our review provides the first comprehensive analysis of the literature about the association between LDL and mortality in the elderly. In essence, it doesn't exist. There, okay? So the cholesterol hypothesis, which goes back to Ansel Keys in the 50s, predicted that LDL will be associated with an increase of all-cause mortality in cardiovascular mortality. Our review shows that either a lack of an association or an inverse association between LDL and both all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. The cholesterol hypothesis. It goes on to talk about breaking things down. Basically, the benefits from statins have been tremendously exaggerated. I go back to that list, especially David Diamond, who's the only non-MD of that group, has done a number of great presentations. You can find them on YouTube, statistically how they were exaggerated. So, or you might say, they don't exist. Technically, you can say there's a little anti-inflammatory effect that comes from statins. Let's hopefully get over that part. All right, so there you go. Here's a link. There's a study. You can punch it in and you can read it and you can print it out and you can give it to your doctor. So conclusion from this is from the review directly, so I'm not paraphrasing, high LDL-C, which is high LDL cholesterol, is inversely associated with mortality. Let me repeat, high cholesterol is inversely associated with mortality, all-cause mortality, which means the higher your cholesterol, the lower your chances of dying of anything. Isn't that just the opposite of what we've been hearing since the 50s, if you've been living that long? This finding is inconsistent with the cholesterol hypothesis. That's it. They pull no punches. This is black and white. It's inconsistent with the high cholesterol hypothesis, upon which there are plenty of statins that are created. We're going to get into that, okay? That is, the cholesterol, particularly LDL-C, is inherently atherogenic, meaning that it can cause plaque, meaning that that can cause heart attacks and or strokes and or other aspects. Since elderly people with high LDL live as long or longer than those with low, our analysis provides reason to question the validity of the cholesterol hypothesis. Boom, punch, done. That's it. That's what you need to know. You can read pages on this, but they have done a great job. So the strengths of this study, and this again is directly from the study. They said the strengths of their study are, this is the first systematic review of cohort studies where low density LDL cholesterol has been analyzed as a risk factor for all-cause and or cardiovascular mortality in elderly. Has been analyzed as a risk factor, meaning it actually isn't a risk factor, okay? Lack of an association or an inverse association, please read twice, or an inverse association between LDL-C and mortality was present in all studies. Rationale for this study. For decades, the main view has been that an elevated level of total cholesterol is a primary cause of atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. There are several contradictions to this view. The number of unselected people, meaning when you do a study, they have certain selection criteria. So when you start peeling them down, you try to get to your perfect group. They're going to have the results, they have the response in your particular study. So unselected people, normal people off the street. So no study of unselected people has found an association between total cholesterol and degree of atherosclerosis. Moreover, in most of the Japanese epidemiological studies, high total cholesterol is not a risk factor for stroke. In fact, there is an inverse association. So it's not just in the United States. In Japan, they're going, we don't see this. We kind of missed it. Okay, there is an inverse association between total cholesterol and all-cause mortality, irrespective of age and sex. All right, so on their study, the first two references they put, which I'm going to follow up on, are from Ravneskov, who is the person we've talked about. He's the one who's been beating this drumbeat since the mid-90s, right? And the Japanese study. But they go on for many other references. So I'm just going to poke into those, which is what you should do for studies generally as well. So back to Ravneskov, back to We'll call him Uff. Let's look at these papers as well, very briefly. So in 2002, this is what they're referencing, was Uff's paper of 2002. He also had another one back in 1998. He had plenty of other papers if you really want to go. But I'm saying, look at this. Here's the man who started questioning the value of statins. And an earlier paper of his is down here. There we go. So 21 years ago, which is a paper they're referencing, it says, is atherosclerosis caused by high cholesterol? And this was actually in a very prominent journal, 2002, back when they were a little more open-minded. Cholesterol does not, this is me distilling down his points, cholesterol does not predict the degree of atherosclerosis at autopsy. There's an idea. Look at people who have died. Do they have atherosclerosis? Do they have a thickening of the arteries? Okay? They didn't find any thickening of the arteries for people who died in heart attacks. What does that mean? Atherosclerosis does not correlate with the degree of coronary atherosclerosis or angiography. So those are screening. Now these are live people, right? They've looked at their heart, says, no, there's no correlation. Or coronary calcification. We're going to get to this in a second. Think of your CAC score. If you don't know what that is, coming up in the next slide. Or peripheral atherosclerosis. Peripheral atherosclerosis is, it's like when you get leg pain because you basically have plugging of the arteries to your extremities, plugging of the arteries to your heart, which gives a heart attack, plugging of the arteries that goes to your brain, which would be a stroke. That's how it goes. So they're all the same thing. They're all the same origin. Okay, so in 25 years, that was 21 years ago, 25 years ago, variance in dissent. He's the voice of dissent out there, pretty much the only one in the world. And they allowed him to publish, which is nice. The questionable role of saturated fats and polyunsaturated fatty acids in cardiovascular disease. The last line from his dissent paper is this: the harmful effect of saturated fats are the protective effects of polyunsaturated fats on atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease are questioned. This is 25 years ago, it's 1998, and he goes back before that saying, I don't see it. I don't see that saturated fats are a bad thing. And that polyunsaturated fats, meaning your omega-6s and your vegetable oils, we'll get to in a second as well, are a good thing. This was him. And I want to bear in mind, this is pre-internet. So the work that he had to do, he had his own medical practice, he had his own results from his patients that he was working on and what he was teaching. He had to go through all the other studies. They were not online. You couldn't just jump over to PubMed and say, well, let's do a quick check. No, that took a lot of time. So the amount of work he had to put together to have a coherent, articulate opinion that people would listen to is phenomenal. So here's the calcium, briefly, coronary calcium scores. This is now current. In the last 5 years, so we got ours done about 5 years ago in Cape Cod. This will cost you about $100, and it's amazing. So I'm just giving you the Mayo Clinic sort of what this is about. And there's a guy named Dr. Agatston, which now he's named, called the Agatston score. He also is the one that came up with the inflammatory marker of CRP, C-reactive protein. Okay, so anyway, here we go. Results. The results of this test is usually given as a number called Agatston score. The score reflects the total area of calcium deposits and the density of calcium. The score of 0 means no calcium. See, this is in your heart. There's a flash. You just lie down and have to take off your clothes. You're going to zip you in and out. You are in and out within 3 minutes, I swear. And so they're basically looking, boom, it's a CAT scan of your heart. Do they see any calcium? So when calcium is present, they then give it a score. So the higher the score, the higher your risk of heart disease. The score is 1 to 300 means it's moderate plaques, which is a high risk of heart attack. And if you have over 300, you have a very high risk of severe disease and heart attack. So that's a pretty foundational thing. Is your heart plugged up with calcium plaque? Take a picture, find out. That's the results you should be working from, not high cholesterol. Here is basically a statin chart. I'm sorry, it is that too. A steroid chart, because here's what I want you to know. That statins block this particular enzyme here called HMG-CoA. Pretty straightforward. I'm not going to ask you to get into the biochemistry. I'm just saying it blocks it. Nothing's going beyond this line. That means that your cholesterol production is decreasing. Cholesterol is needed for every hormone in your body. Sex hormones, thyroid hormones, all the hormones, right? And so if you start cutting down on the production of that, you're going to start cutting down on the production of all these other things. The number one symptom that is associated with statins is muscle pain and inflammation. But think of this. Now I threw up a steroid pathways, which is pretty generic, saying if you block this, you block progesterone, you block testosterone, you block all the various estrogens, you block DHEA. If you don't know what these are, you can read about them. But anyways, notice the paper here. Statin treatment induced development of type 2 diabetes from clinical evidence to mechanistic insights. Italics are mine, and this is mine too. More on that coming up. That was 2020, 3 years ago, from Spain. Notice it's outside the United States. This is very important to look at. So this is a book that came out in 2006 by an MD doctor who always wanted to be an astronaut. He became an astronaut. He became the flight surgeon, but they wouldn't let him go up to an actual flight. So he wasn't an actual astronaut that got to get in space, okay? And he was very disappointed by that. Why was that? Because when he was in the program, they noticed his cholesterol was high. They told him to go on a statin. So he went on a statin, and suddenly he gets these side effects of his statins that were not the muscle pain. They were what they called transient global amnesia. He would have bouts of, I don't know what happened. So this is this actual story from this book. I've read this twice. And I want to point out a couple things. Kilmer McCulley, he's also part of the Thinks Association that I pointed out under Ravneskov. And Jay Cohen has died back in, I think it was 2015. But a very liberal UCLA physician, I believe he was the head of the medical school that actually wrote some of these as well. Kilmer McCulley is on the East Coast. Basically, he currently has a job at the VA in Providence, Rhode Island. He was fired from Harvard, and I've done a number of podcasts about him on this, for saying homocysteine, elevated homocysteine, is the cause for heart disease, not cholesterol. Boom, he got fired. And the papers he wrote were suppressed in the United States, but they became so popular in Europe that Harvard had to take him back into his lab. He didn't take that job. He basically got a job at the VA in Providence, Rhode Island. How's that? But anyway, in this book, Dr. Graveline says that what would happen, and this is the one that I remember, is that he went to Home Depot and he picked up what he had to pick up, whether it was lumber or a drill bit or something else from Home Depot, comes home, parks the car, and he's about to go in. He looks in the back seat and sees the lumber and the drill bits that he bought, and he freaks out. He goes, somebody's been in my car. Who has been in my car? Who put these things in my car? So he goes and tells his wife. He's still sort of freaking out. This is really bizarre, honey. Look what just happened. Pulls out the receipt and found out it was him. So transient total global amnesia is not remembering for blocks of time. Obviously, he got scrubbed from the NASA astronaut program. They couldn't have him do spacewalks and forget why he was sent out there, right? There you go. All right, what I want you to do is to look down. This is now from Ravneskov's paper from 2002, just to give you, we're not going through all of this. We're just going through the dates here. Catch an eye on the dates, right? So this was the study I told you to bring to your doctors, the number one reference they had, and now we're referencing that paper from 2002. Notice, all right, 1984, 1998, 1995, 1936, 1961, 1960, 1962. So what were some of these titles? Serum cholesterol and atherosclerosis in man. That's 1961. Serum cholesterol levels in human atherosclerosis, 1960. Atherosclerosis and level of serum cholesterol in post-mortem investigations, 1962. On and on. There's 93, 85, 81, 79, 80, 89. So that idea has already been out there for the longest time. There was plenty of people saying, I don't think this is right. I think that we got a problem here, that this cholesterol thing doesn't make sense. This is that story. Okay, however, something is still missing. Despite all of these review of studies, etc., there's no personal experience. No, they're all pointing to a study. They didn't do their study, they pointed to a study. See that study? See that study? But the question I always have when I go to conferences, well, what about your data? You're a practicing physician. What does your data say? Do you agree? They go, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Really? Well, where's your data? And they go, oh, we can't do that because of HIPAA. Sure you do. You sure you can put up anonymous data? Anyway, so despite all these reviews of studies, etc., there's no personal experiences, no lab data, no data from their collective patients. Everyone was a doctor in the Thinks group, except one, except David Diamond. This is the piece I will show you in hopes that other doctors will do likewise. What is the missing piece? All right, enter scatter plots and their predictive values. Scatter plot allows us to quickly understand relationships that would be nearly impossible to recognize in a table. Let me show you. Now we're using my data. Only about 35 people, because that's all and I'll show you from spreadsheets and so on, but we're going to go through this and we're using my data. So you can always criticize by saying, who is this doctor? Who is this guy who's using his data, who's showing you all this? You can always say that. But if every other doctor did this, they'd have the same data as me. I'm going to show you that. So what is a scatter plot? A scatter plot and their predictive ability. This is the point, the predictive ability. What is a scatter plot and why you should care? Example, let's say you have a farm and you've been measuring cedar trees for 50 years. So you have a farm of, let's say, 20 trees. And for 50 years, you've gone out and you've measured the diameter. Year 1, year 2, year 3, 4. Now you have 50 years of data, right? So now somebody comes along. So now you plotted this, right? Here's years here, and here's the age of the tree here, and here's the diameter. So you have some graph, whatever that looks like. But you now have data, it's locked in. A couple things you can do with this. Somebody comes up and says, I was thinking getting a cedar tree. How big diameter, if you want to throw in height as well, as one of your data points, you could do that, pretty easy. How big would a cedar tree be in 13 years? I'm thinking about putting one in my yard. And you go, you would know exactly how big that's going to be. You'd know exactly how tall that's going to be. That's the predictive value. In fact, you could go into a forest, and for the most part, it's not your controlled farm for sure. You can go into a forest, find a cedar tree, and go, it's this diameter. You know how old it is. You don't have to cut it down like this. You know how old it is, and that's remarkable. And it all came from you just taking basically 2 points or 3 points if you wanted to do diameter, and if you want to do height. Boom! That's a scatter plot. It was created by a guy named Descartes who lived in the early 1600s. You hear about Cartesian math. Well, Cartesian math is basically the X and Y. This is the X axis, and that's the Y axis. He invented that as well. So he's the first to really launch into what we consider modern math. He also said things like, he was a philosopher, he said things you can't step twice into the same river, meaning time changes everything, so you can never reproduce a situation. He also said, I think, therefore I am. Amazing guy. So here's my part of my spreadsheet saying, I'm trying to give you the point of, here's the table. As much as I can go look at all these different tests and patterns we can see, and I put them in red for outside of lab ranges, and so you get this. But it's better. So I took omega-3, your omega-3 test here, and I say, all right, we bring them down to here. We simply do omega-3 over there, omega-3 index is what they call it, versus age. Wouldn't that be interesting? And what we find is that people who are older, that's what this means, the older people have higher levels of omega-3 as opposed to younger people. How would you look this? Those who live longest have higher levels. Those who don't live longer, perhaps these people all died off, but you have an interesting relationship between elevated, higher, and we know that the ideal range from Dr. Sinopoulos, we've talked about before, ideal range is 8% of omega-3. That's EPA, DHA, otherwise known as fish oils. So that's your ideal range. As you get older, you get closer to that range. Or you could say people who had this range earlier lived longer. That's a relationship. You start to question these things. Cool, huh? So here's part of that spreadsheet that I put together a little more organized. And yes, it does have its values, but I sort of stretched out a few things. Here's the omega-6-3 ratio. There's the omega index that I told you about a second ago. So now we're looking at, we sorted this from left to right on the omega-6-3 ratio. Highest versus the lowest. The unhealthiest is the highest omega-6 versus 3, and the healthier is the lowest. And ideally, you want to get to a 1-to-1 ratio. That's what we believe ancestrally existed. All right, so we put all that and we go, all right, well, all right, what's this going to do? You know, what are we going to see? Here we go, omega-6-3 ratio. We just took that data and we compared it to insulin resistance. So that was another column. Let's go back. We compared it to insulin resistance right down there, HOMA-IR. So, you know, you can't ballpark. You go, well, this sort of looks like it's related. Yeah, okay, is there a relationship? So now we go, wow, look at that. Omega-6-3 ratio has direct influence. That means that the implication would be that, and we're talking about you want to get to a 1-1 ratio. So if you were at a 1-1 ratio, which is way down here, this whole thing starts at 5, nobody has a 1-1, is that would be your best, your lowest insulin resistance, would be no insulin resistance at that point. Phenomenal. So you go, wow, that's correlated. Now let's look at the omega-3-6 ratio. There's your 1-1, right? Now with the omega-3-6 is on the bottom, 1 to 18. That's terrible. That's great. And now we compare it to HDL, LDL, and total cholesterol. And what we find is that the higher your 6-3 ratio is the lower your LDL. So that would be a good thing if we're looking at LDL and a bad thing if we're looking at your 6-3 ratio. What the heck is going on? The relationship becomes obvious, but some questions are starting to rise up out of. So every doctor can do this, by the way. This is not esoteric. This is not highly specialized. How would I know? Now, time to talk about me for a second. How would I know? In short, I run many labs on clients in 4 areas. Their collective data reveals an obvious reality that anyone can understand. Let's look. Okay, so what I test for, not going into so much about, what is my context? You need to know, who is this guy railing on about this? What I test for is metabolic, which is what we're going to be looking at today. That's the screens you've already seen. Those are the spreadsheets you've already seen. I look at nutrient, I'll show you in a second, hormonal and genomic. That, I think, is the ideal necessary. Are they perfect? No, but they give me an overlap, a Venn diagram approach, if you will, to sort of saying, where do we need to work at? What are the key things to make this person healthier if they have a problem? Or where can we look? So here we go. So this is the same quadrants that I broke down. Here's what we've been looking at, right? That big spreadsheet that we're going in saying we've got to make sense of this. This is what we're going to be talking about today. Here's their intracellular nutrient deficiencies, which is very important, and I tie this to methylation and so on and so forth. Hormonal, we look at cortisol, cortisone, we look at DHEA, we look at sex hormones. Where are we in excess? Where are we deficient? When you find people that have a really stressful job, they'll probably look like this one here. As an aside, they just can't get enough cortisol, adrenal hormone, to make it through the day. They were exhausted. They've been beaten down by whatever sort of prolonged stress, financial, relationship, job, whatever. And so they are beginning to show signs of adrenal insufficiency. And so that grows into things called Addison's, which is your adrenal glands start to burn out. So this is a step towards that. And the last is genomic. We look for not all mutations, but we look for some key genomic mutations that mean you have a higher requirement for certain nutrient deficiencies. You see where we're going with this? And that's what I do. So this is my perspective. This is what is missing from the LDL cholesterol story in terms anyone can understand. All right, a closer look at LDL, low density lipoprotein, through scatter plots. Now we have LDL of all those people on that spreadsheet by age. What we find is, yes, indeed, LDL does go up with age, but remember the omega-3 went up. So what this is saying is that when you look at people who have lived longer, they have a higher level of LDL. Did these people always have that high level and they were just healthier and lived a longer life? I'm thinking more than likely, and this is what all these other studies are showing. And so this is a positive correlation. So you have omega-3 to get to that 8% increased over life. Those who lived longer had higher levels. That's a good thing. Your LDL, those who lived longer had higher levels. That's a good thing, but it's against the cholesterol hypothesis. So now you're going, I don't know about this. So then by age, all cholesterols. Here's the LDL. I did the same sort of sign, the same sort of scatter plot. Now I threw an HDL and LDL. What do we find is that they all go up. Your HDL, for those who live longer, have higher levels of HDL. That's why we talk about HDL. They have higher levels of LDL, which is what I just showed you over here. They have higher levels, of course, of total cholesterol. Now what is all this? That's the opposite. I don't get this. My doctor would not agree with this. Yeah, that's because they don't do this. And they could do it in a day or a week. Assign this to the data they already have. So everyone's cholesterol increases with age, those who live longer. Isn't that bad? No one is on statins in this group, by the way. Then by medically recommended levels. So this is now putting in the levels at which doctors are required to tell you, you should think about going on a statin, son, or honey. And so here we go. So here's a lipid panel, as you see in your blood work. You have triglycerides. It says you want it under 150. That makes sense for sure. HDL says you want over 40. Yep. It says triglyceride HDL ratio is, we'll get to that in a second. Cholesterol, you want under 200 or over 200. You are recommended a statin. LDL, which is what we've been talking about, you want that under 100. If it's over 100, you're recommended a statin. So now let's put all of this. I showed you this graph, right? Here's age, here's LDL, here's total cholesterol, here's HDL. So now we know where those came from. Now let's look at at what point they cross. So if we're looking at LDL right here, LDL right here, basically at age 20, 25, most people start to get higher levels of LDL. And so we go all the way over here to 80, we're up by 200. So basically anybody over 20 can be prescribed a statin because their LDL is too high. Now let's look at when, per my data group, right, these people go over 200 for their total cholesterol. That's around age 40. So anybody over 40 has two reasons. Their total cholesterol, too high. And your LDL cholesterol, too high. You have two reasons to get on statins. Better get on statins. You don't want to have a stroke or a heart attack or phlebitis, do you? Okay, what about omega-3 and the omega-3/6 ratio we just looked at? All right, boing. So now what I did is I popped out a few scatter plots. And here's somebody who basically said, my mother, who's 88, her doctor is telling her she should be on a statin. Let's think about that. She's 88, which is higher than the average mortality in the United States. 88, she should be on a statin because she's going to have a stroke or a heart attack? I'd say whatever she's doing well. Let her have her life. But so I asked him to get these numbers for me so I could put it on the chart. So I simply threw her number into the pre-existing chart, and she's exactly right on. She's 88, which is really off the end. 212 is perfect. So there is the average of age of LDL. Perfect, her level, 88-year-old female. She could have higher HDL, be good, and she could have lower triglycerides. We'll get into that. So here we looked at, I'm throwing in just age and glucose. This is everybody that of that particular spreadsheet. And for the most part, it's level. If anything, your glucose comes down for the older people. Interesting, your glucose comes down or stays level. It doesn't go up for those who live longer. All right, what about your trigs, right? Your triglycerides over HDL ratio. This is kind of what they call a back of the napkin, a cheap version of insulin resistance. Instead of HOMA-IR, which has to do with glucose, fasting glucose and insulin, this is triglycerides and HDL. So what about that ratio with time? That ratio with time, it shows people get better. So those who live longer have better glucose. And so anything 1.5 or greater is insulin resistance. But as those who lived longer have better, lower insulin resistance, as I showed you before. Isn't that interesting? So I put her number there. Her number is higher. So I said, I would be thinking about maybe dropping some of the carbs, in her diet, but we didn't go too deep there. Also, we look at now triglycerides over age. With age, they stay pretty much level with, more or less that's like a perfect line, but it's really high. So for those who live longer, have pretty much a constant level of triglycerides. Okay, so now about omega-3 versus age. We've seen that before. That gets higher with age, which should I say, reverse that. Those who live longer, right? We took the blood of older people and found out their omega-3 was higher. So the implication would be you need higher levels for greater longevity of omega-3. And the omega-6/3 is kind of the opposite. Your omega-3 is low, your omega-6 is high. Way too much vegetable oil, right? Is the opposite. They're saying the same thing. Hope you're finding value in that. Again, the omega-3 with LDL now. So here we go. Omega-3 is going up this way, and LDL is over here. This is the predictive value of the scatter plots. Look at this. We get up to the ideal level of omega-3, 8%. Let's bring that over. Does anybody hit that level? Well, anybody who hits that level has really high, by conventional medical standards, has really high LDL, 350, 400. Let's look at the omega-3/6 ratio with LDL. That also says when you get down to the ideal 1-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to 3, where does that put us in terms of LDL? Really in the area of 400. So now we're getting the idea maybe our LDL should actually be higher throughout our whole life. Okay, the point, according to this, if you had a healthy level of omega-3, 8, right, over there, and an omega-6/3 ratio of 1-to-1, then your LDL is predicted to be between 350 and 400. Can this possibly be true? The higher your omega-3 index, the higher your LDL will be. The higher your omega-6, the lower your LDL will be. We have a choice. So seen together is this way. Here we go. I did this again. Omega-3, 1-to-1 ratio is here, and 18 is over here. Bad. This is good. And we see that, as I showed you before, having a bad omega-6/3 ratio brings down all of your cholesterols, your total, your LDL, and a little bit on your HDL as well. This shows that having high omega-6, very unhealthy, will decrease your LDL levels, which is encouraged by conventional medicine. Unhealthy. All right, and there's the omega-3, the same thing. As your omega-3 increases to that ideal level, your total cholesterol increases, your LDL increases, your HDL increases. This shows that having very high omega-3, very healthy. We're going to change that right now. There we go. Having very high omega-3, very healthy, and 8 is not very high, it's just higher than most people have it, will increase your LDL levels. So the omega-3 index is more predictive than cholesterol. This is from a Harvard study, by the way. This is not me. I've just sort of showed you that's true. Erythrocytes, red blood cells, long-chain omega-3 fatty acid levels are inversely associated with mortality. Wait a minute. It just said higher omega-3 is associated with higher LDL, but it said higher omega-3 is inversely associated with mortality, with death, and with incidence of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks. That's the Framingham Heart Study. The Framingham Heart Study said this? The Framingham Heart Study supposedly is where Ansel Keys went to get his cholesterol hypothesis. So that's from 2018, the Clinical Journal of Lipidology from Harvard. Amazing. Okay, again, higher omega-6, lower omega-3 leads to pro-inflammatory, leads to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular, intestinal bowel disease, arthritis, and Alzheimer's disease. Oh my gosh, we don't want the omega-6. Highest omega-6 here. I bring you back to you saying, all right, all this data here that Dr. Goldkamp has. Highest omega-6 equals high inflammation, highest mitochondrial dysfunction. Okay, there we go. Now we look at, so you go, all right, I see it. And here's the omega-3 index down there. They're sort of saying high risk for high omega-6. All right, okay. So how our nutritional cholesterol guidelines were created, how the 2 largest studies ever done at the time were misinterpreted and never publicly corrected, except here. Okay, so the Minnesota Coronary study, and I'm not going deep into this, I did another video on these a long time ago on omega-6. So the original conclusion was substituting dietary omega-6, linoleic acid, think of a person's name, linoleic acid, in place of saturated fats, lowered serum cholesterol. That would be true, but there were no differences between the 2 groups regarding cardiovascular events, cardiovascular death and mortality in general. Then it was updated. Somebody went back, the whole video, it's amazing. Dr. Ramsden went back and he got the data and he said, all right, well, the real conclusion should be, so the real conclusion was there was a 22% higher risk of death for everybody who had high omega-6. And you go, for each 30 milligrams per deciliter, blah, 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 they had a higher risk of death. There was no evidence for benefit for coronary atherosclerosis or heart attacks in the group. These cholesterol lowering interventions showed no evidence of benefits. So that was redone in 2016 from the original study, which this was all based on in the late 60s. Again, Sydney Diet Heart Study, 66 to 73. Original conclusion was lowered serum cholesterol levels by having omega-6. That's true, we showed you that. But there is no difference between the 2 groups regarding cardiovascular events and health in general, Updated conclusion was increased risk of death from all causes. Oh my gosh! Oops, they forgot that. Okay, and here's where you can find that. There's the actual studies. Dr. Ramsden amazing that he did this, to think to even do this. And I've gone through all that, so I'm not going through all that again. This is just saying this is where I get the information, and it's real. Okay, so the analysis of the recovered heart of the Sydney, same thing. Here's the conclusion I read you, and there's the study for that. Houston, we have a problem with the data. What is the correct data, please, before we launch? Which is it? So in order for you to get your LDL down, you need to increase your glucose. So this basically shows, this is from my data, remember, so those with the higher glucoses had the lower LDL. So if you're looking at LDL, increase your glucose. Okay, now let me superimpose that 100 mark, saying anything above 100 is where you prescribed statins, right? Okay, we know a good normal glucose is around 80. In the 80s, okay? Don't sweat the small stuff. There's 110, so around here is where you should be. So here's the good level, right? So this says if you have good blood glucose, it says your LDL will more than likely be 170. No. Conventional medicine said, bad. All right, so this is the red line. This is the line you do not cross. They will prescribe you. All right, so then the question is, well, how high do you have to get your glucose in order to be below the 100, according to my data, right? That's the caveat in the end, according to my data. All right, 190. Do you think 190 glucose is healthy? I don't think so. All right, another look. Hemoglobin A1C, which is really your 90-day average of blood glucose, right? Okay, so LDL cholesterol. Here's your healthy area. You want a hemoglobin A1C between the 4s and low 5s. So if it gets higher, as I reference over here, you got trouble. You're pre-diabetes or diabetes. So healthy, unhealthy. Here's the line, and it says basically as your hemoglobin A1C becomes higher, you become unhealthy. We kind of knew that, right? You're headed towards diabetes. Here's just fleshing it out. Here's the 100 mark, and here's the 5.7, which is beyond which you're pre-diabetic. Beyond 65, you are diabetic. And so now I did that same graph saying, well, how high would our hemoglobin 1AC have to be for our LDL to be 100 or below? 7.75. That's hugely dangerous. Hugely dangerous. That's insanity. So in order to get your LDL down below 100, you would have to increase your hemoglobin A1C to 7.75. Oh my gosh, huge metabolic disease. Why does your LDL decrease as your glucose increases? Here you go. As your glucose increases, it makes fat. Your liver turns it into triglycerides. So fat is into the bloodstream, right? So your triglycerides rise. That's why that triglyceride and HDL ratio was important. We're measuring triglycerides. So this increases as your glucose increases. What decreases? Your LDL decreases as your glucose increases. This is the difference. And so in other words, your LDL is low density lipoprotein. It's a fat in the blood. There's basically a constant sort of homeostatic, if you will, a constant of how much fat should be in the blood. Generally speaking, if you have increased it by glucose, turning into triglycerides, then you'll decrease the LDL. Another way you can look at it, that's the whole ApoB conversation. Didn't want to go into ApoB, but that's what this is referring to. Notice with the highest glucose levels and the highest triglycerides, you have the lowest LDL. So like I just did that, this is the old-fashioned way, now spreadsheet, which is pretty revealing as well. Here's the highest of this particular group of people that I could fit on legibly on this particular chart. Is highest glucose was 201. That's fasting glucose. Highest triglycerides were 408. In fact, the triglycerides were so high that there was so much fat in the blood they couldn't read the LDL. So it was unreadable. That's what this little note is. Triglycerides are too high to obtain an actual reading. All right, let's default to the second highest. So second highest glucose was 180, and its LDL was 102, right? Right at that line. Remember he said 180? It's amazing how that turned out. 180, and your LDL was roughly 100, and your triglycerides were roughly 250. So there you go. Are you getting the story? So in the next episode, I'll continue with part 2. What is required to be diagnosed as diabetic and what labs you need to get for yourself? What does that have to do with LDL? So just to give you a little taste, fasting glucose is for to be diagnosed with diabetes is to be really 3 readings over 126, random glucose 200 over 200, hemoglobin 1AC over 6.5, which is what I showed you in that last film, that last clip, the last image. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics, as you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.